Hi, everybody. I'm Mary Beth Horsington on behalf of the Strathmore Speaker Series. Thank you so much for stopping in here tonight for our second event of the 2021 season. Under normal circumstances, we'd be holding this event at the Fire Barn in Onondaga Park in the Strathmore neighborhood, but COVID has necessitated the switch to Zoom. Fortunately, the Onondaga Free Library is providing the technical assistance we need to bring you this program, and we thank them for their expertise and generosity. The Strathmore Speaker Series is made possible through the support of the City of Syracuse, the Gifford Foundation, and the Greater Strathmore Neighborhood Association. Our guest speaker tonight is Cornell University professor Suzanne Mettler. She's here to talk about her book, Four Threats: The Recurring Crises of American Democracy. Dr. Mettler will examine American democracy and how threats like political polarization, racism and nativism, economic inequality, and excessive executive power have menaced our republic throughout our history. Because all four of these things threaten our country right now, how will we get through this with our democracy intact? Dr. Mettler is the John L. Senior Professor of American Institutions in the Government Department at Cornell. Her interests focus on American political development, inequality, public policy, political behavior, and democracy. She has authored 6 books and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, as well as a recipient of Guggenheim and Radcliffe Fellowships. When Dr. Mettler completes her talk, there will be a question and answer session, so stay tuned to your Zoom screen. And now, please welcome our speaker, Dr. Suzanne Mettler.
Thank you so much, Marianne and Scott, and thank you to all of you for coming out tonight, as it were, turning on Zoom tonight. I'm really delighted to be with you because, in fact, I live here in Syracuse. So I've lived here since the early 90s. I taught at Syracuse University in the Maxwell School for many years before I went to Cornell. My husband teaches at Lemoyne, and when I went to Cornell, our kids let us know that, you know, we're Syracusans, so we've stayed here, and very happy to be here. And so it's lovely to be with all of you. So just over 1 month ago, we all watched in horror as hundreds of Trump supporters stormed the US Capitol, trying to interfere with the final step in confirming the results of the 2020 election. They desecrated the sanctuary of American democracy with the Confederate flags and Nazi symbols by trying to overturn the will of the voters with brute force. 6 people died, many police officers were badly wounded, and in fact, it could have been much worse. Most shocking of all, the insurrection was incited by the president himself, who had spent the past few months denying his loss in the presidential election, despite all evidence to the contrary. To their credit, members of Congress reconvened that very evening and ultimately confirmed the election results. But 139 members of the House Republican caucus, the majority of that caucus, plus several senators, refused to recognize the results of some states. So Robert Lieberman and I finished our book and sent it off to press last spring. And then over the next 9 months leading up to the election and in the months since then, damage to American democracy escalated. And so many of the events that have occurred in 2020 and the early weeks of 2021 reminded us of occurrences in the American past that we had written about in our book at other times when democracy was also in danger. And the January 6th insurrection took us back to the late 19th century. So now I want to try to share my screen. Let's see if I can do this okay. There we go. Can you see it?
Yep, we're good.
Great. Okay. Okay, so I want to take you back to the late 19th century. In the decades following the Civil War, democracy for those who had rights to participate was quite vibrant, and it included African-American men in the South who had gained voting rights and were participating at high rates in elections, and running for office, like these men who were Black members of the US Congress. And they were running primarily as Republicans. Party system was different at that time, and they were Republicans. Also, the People's Party emerged in 1892 out of the agrarian populist movement, and it too began to run candidates quite successfully. But at that very juncture, democracy was thrown into crisis. Now let's zoom into North Carolina in the 1890s. There, Republicans and populists noticed that if they could join forces and run candidates on what they called a fusion ballot, they stood a chance of beating the Democrats. And at that time, the Democrats were the dominant party in the South, the party run by white elites. And that's what they did. So in 1896, the fusionists managed to elect Republicans as governor and to the majority of the state's seats in the US House of Representatives and the state assembly. At that juncture, Democrats' worst fears had come to pass, and they began to plot their way back to power. In 1898, they staged a coup d'etat in the city of Wilmington. It was the state's largest urban area, and it was a success story. African Americans had been moving into the middle class, and 3 members of the Board of Aldermen were Black, as were numerous public sector employees. The Daily Record was a Black-owned newspaper, and as a daily, it was the only one of its kind in the nation. So democracy seemed to be on the rise. But on the morning of November 10th, nearly 2,000 white men who belonged to these paramilitary groups. On the left, you see the red shirts, and on the white is a button for another one, the White Government Union. 2,000 of them gathered at the city armory. They marched to the offices of the Daily Record. They set the building on fire and they watched it burn. Then they advanced through Black neighborhoods and they murdered hundreds of residents. They dragged prominent people from their homes and took them to the train station and made them leave town. Before the day was out, the coup leaders at gunpoint forced the resignations of the mayor and aldermen and installed their own in their place. On January 6, 2021, the similarities were all too striking. Just like in 1898, there were armed white supremacists, once again being the most visible in this insurrection. Also, in both instances, it was political party leaders who had incited the violence and spread misinformation. And what occurred in both events, 1898 and 2021, was that these party leaders were unwilling to abide by the most fundamental principle of democracy, that when elections are held, someone will lose, and when you or your party loses, you have to accept the outcome and stand down, concede, and communicate to your supporters that they must do the same. So the overarching question for our book, oh, and I'm sorry, this is this particular photo is these groups when they go to the offices of the Daily Record and they burn it down on that day. So the overarching question of our book is whether we really need to be worried fundamentally today about whether American democracy is in peril. And, you know, even after the events of the last few years, there are many political scientists who would say that democracy has prevailed and ultimately we did have a transfer of power, albeit not a peaceful one. But many think that the United States is protected by having the oldest constitution in the world, complete with its checks and balances. And the United States is also a wealthy nation, which is a factor that we know makes the loss of democracy unlikely. In addition, while the nation in the 1790s included institutions that repudiated democracy, most of all slavery, and I would argue the United States did not become a full democracy until the 1960s and 1970s. But it's still fair to say that democracy has progressed over time, particularly in these past 50 years, becoming more robust and inclusive. So that makes it seem unlikely that we would undergo real backsliding. On the other hand, American democracy can be considered to be at risk of deteriorating because what we've learned from those who studied democratic deterioration in other nations is that these days we don't tend to see democracy taken at the barrel of a gun or canceled elections or the disbanding of a legislature. Rather, it tends to happen in more subtle ways. Typically, elections are still held, and yet democracy decays, and a nation becomes something of a hybrid, combining some features of democracy and others of authoritarianism. So in other words, we shouldn't be thinking of democracy as having an on-off switch, but rather as being on a continuum. And the question at any point in time is whether we're moving toward becoming more of a full democracy, or we're backsliding in the direction of autocracy. So that's the task we take on in the book. We examined 5 earlier periods in American history when people were concerned about backsliding. And we observed the patterns that ensued, and then we analyzed the contemporary period in light of what we've learned. So first of all, what do we mean by democracy? We're looking at it to, in the simplest terms, as a system of representative government with accountability to citizens through elections. And there are 4 basic pillars that make this work. The first is free and fair elections. And of course, that includes abiding by the outcome of the election. The winner gets to govern. The winners get to govern. The rule of law, the legitimacy of the opposition, and the integrity of rights, meaning civil liberties and civil rights and voting rights. And of course, the integrity of rights is something that has developed gradually throughout American history. The others were more present from quite early on. And these 4 features give us the indicators that we can assess in the 5 periods and the present to see whether democracy is retreating or not. And we've learned from those who study democracy around the world that there are 4 key threats that make it vulnerable. And I'm guessing that all of these might sound kind of familiar to you. Political polarization, conflict over who belongs as a member of the political community, rising economic inequality, and executive aggrandizement. I'm going to take a few moments to speak about them one by one. So first of all, political polarization. This has, of course, been on the rise now for several decades in the United States. And what we know is that democracy works well when there are multiple groups and identities in a society, and people have what we call overlapping or cross-cutting affiliations. So for example, you might, in your place of work, have people who have different political viewpoints than you, and you might come into people with different political viewpoints in your place of worship or civic organizations, etc. What's problematic is that when all of these differences increasingly align and people sort themselves into 2 camps of us versus them, and then politics can cease to be to involve a process of negotiation and accommodation, and it becomes more like mortal combat. And you start to perceive your political opponents as enemies. And we've been, like, all kinds of survey data really suggests that we are moving toward that increasingly in the United States. And this has been happening both among the public and among lawmakers. It's been happening for some time in the US Congress, where members of a party start to act increasingly like a team, and there's less room for negotiation over policy goals. But we've certainly seen it at the grassroots level among ordinary citizens. The second threat is what we call who belongs. So democracy works well when people agree on who is a member of the political community and what their status is. If there's an unresolved formative rift in the nation's founding over who is included, it can reemerge as a source of trouble again and again, whether it's over race or ethnicity, gender, etc. And in the periods that Rob and I examined, battles over race take center stage, especially those concerning those who are most overtly excluded in the nation's founding, African Americans. So we see that again and again. And what tends to happen when conflict really emerges is that you have one side that is trying to work for greater equality, and the other side is resistant to it and saying we need to preserve our heritage or our way of life. And when they are willing to do so at all costs, never mind democracy, that's when it becomes particularly dangerous. The third threat is rising economic inequality. Now, when I first learned about this from the comparative scholars, I thought it meant that, you get the 99% who want to rise up and have a revolution. But in fact, that's not what endangers democracy. It's the other way around. When you have high inequality, those who are the affluent, vested, powerful interests want to cement their gains and political power because they're afraid that if everyone else gains political power, they're going to have higher taxes and regulations and other policies they don't like. And so they are willing to pursue their interests at all costs, never mind democracy. It's this recurring thing of when you have one side in a conflict that wants to protect what they have at all costs, democracy is endangered. And then finally, the fourth threat is executive aggrandizement. And this refers to the enlargement and concentration of powers of the nation's top leader in the United States, of course, the presidency, and the demise of checks and balances that come with that can make a nation more vulnerable to tyranny. It's not to say it necessarily becomes tyrannical. Presidential power has been growing in the United States since the 1930s. Of course, during Watergate, you had a president who did really try to abuse those executive powers. But lots of other presidents who've, you could point to certain ways in which they pushed the envelope, but they did not really abuse it in quite, egregious, constant ways. So all four of these threats have waxed and waned and combined in different ways throughout American history. And what we've learned overall in looking at all these periods is that American democracy has been fragile time and again. And actually, I would say that the last 50 years have been a time that's been relatively calm by comparison. I think, all of us have been, who are, around my age, have been fortunate to grow up in the United States when we did during this period that was relatively calm, where we really didn't have to worry about democracy in a fundamental way. So let me describe one particular historic period and try to and think to yourselves, try to guess what period this might be. So political polarization had been growing for years, and each action by one camp provoked an even greater counter-reaction from their opponents. Then the president signed into law provisions that made it more difficult for immigrants to attain citizenship and permitted the United States to deport immigrants who were deemed dangerous or from hostile nations. In addition, the president signed a law that would allow for the prosecution of journalists who openly criticized his administration. This was a barely disguised effort to weaken the political opposition. So this year was in fact not 2017 or 2018 or 19 or 20, rather it was 1798. And President John Adams had just signed the Alien and Sedition Acts. So here we are in the 1790s. Adams' emergent party, the Federalists, defended the acts as essential for national security, or as one congressman put it, there was no need to, quote, invite hordes of wild Irishmen, nor the turbulent and disorderly of all the world, to come here with a basic view to distract our tranquility, end quote. Indeed, no sooner was the ink dry on the US Constitution than Americans became deeply polarized. Public officials led the way, and among them, leaders who just years earlier had spoken of the mischiefs of faction. The Washington administration already had a media outlet, the Gazette of the United States, which was established to promote favorable views of the government. Thomas Jefferson created a competing newspaper, the National Gazette, to give voice to the emerging opposition, the Republicans. A war of words commenced. James Madison and Jefferson wrote anonymously for the Republican newspaper, lambasting the Federalists, and Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton penned vitriolic responses, also anonymously, defending the Federalists. Ordinary Americans, too, took sides. Federalists and Republicans often resided in different neighborhoods and attended different churches. As hostilities grew, they each took on their own ways of demonstrating their patriotism, and they burned public figures in effigy. Here on the right, you see John Jay being burned in effigy by Republicans after George Washington sent him to Britain to negotiate a trade agreement that was very contentious at the time. And over on the left, you see a copy of the National Gazette. So polarization grew quickly. Political leaders had not yet developed the concept of a legitimate political opposition, that groups could take different approaches to governing and compete with each other routinely through the political process. Their conflicts took on the proportions of mortal combat because they viewed the very existence of the nation as being at stake. Many Americans watching the growing division worried that self-government might not survive the decade. They feared that monarchy might reassert itself, aristocracy replace representative government, or some states might secede from the Union and cause its demise. So the point is that early American democracy was fragile. And in that era, it was due to one threat acting alone, and that was just political polarization. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the 1790s, which was just a fascinating period to learn about. And I should say too, some of you might know the historian Roger Sharp, who taught at Syracuse University for many years. He and I actually used to be office neighbors when I was in the Maxwell School. And much of what I learned about the 1790s comes from his fabulous scholarship. Our book generally, we draw on the work of historians, and then we as political scientists analyze it through the frameworks that we have. But right here in Syracuse, Roger Sharp was tremendously helpful to me. So here we have a scene from the Whiskey Rebellion and someone being tarred and feathered. This was a very common form of torture in those days. And it sounds like it would be quite unpleasant if you had to undergo it. In 1791, people living near the frontier in Western Pennsylvania did not like the new federal tax on whiskey that was part of Hamilton's financial plan. They declared themselves obligated to obstruct the operation of the law until we're able to obtain its total repeal. And most of them did so peacefully, but there were those who used violence. Rebels accosted federal tax collectors and tarred and feathered them or destroyed their homes. And federal officials in the area began to fear for their lives. The Whiskey Rebellion simmered for 3 years. In 1794, 6,000 rebels gathered, plotting to disrupt the federal mail service and to attack Pittsburgh to seize ammunition. So at this point, President Washington is really becoming nervous that a civil war was imminent. And so he decided that this insurrection had to be put down by force. He ordered a 15,000-man militia gathered from 4 states to march to the region. He himself led the mission, riding serenely on horseback. And I was just delighted. I had these research assistants working with me, these undergraduates, and I asked them to try to find artwork that showed some scenes from the book. And they found George Washington here on horseback, going off to, here you have the commander-in-chief actually leading the troops to suppress an insurrection out on the frontier. So by the time the troops arrived, however, the insurrection had subsided and the most outspoken leaders had fled into the frontier. Well, next, Washington faced opposition from another quarter, civic groups that were organizing themselves as active citizens. They were called the Democratic Republican Societies, and they proliferated from Maine to South Carolina during the 1790s. And these organizations, today we would think that they're very respectable because they encourage citizens to learn about government and to take a stand on issues. They openly criticized the Washington administration because they thought it had abandoned the revolution's ideals. The Federalists, by contrast, held more traditional and hierarchical views, and they considered citizens to have a role only in electing their representatives. And aside from that, they thought that public officials should be left alone to govern and treated with deference. And President Washington, being one of the Federalists, became incensed by these societies. To him, it was inappropriate for ordinary citizens to organize themselves politically and attempt to influence government in between elections. Without evidence, he held them responsible for the Whiskey Rebellion. He said, and here's a quote, "My mind is so perfectly convinced that if these self-created societies cannot be discountenanced, they will destroy the government of this country," end quote. Washington appealed to Congress to stand behind him by issuing a resolution to condemn the societies. Madison and Jefferson, as Republicans, deeply disapproved, considering this action akin to demanding a loyalty oath while denouncing civic activity by ordinary citizens. Madison called it the greatest error of the president's political life. Well, what happens next is that Thomas Jefferson believes that the Alien and Sedition Acts endangered the basic right of dissent and that they were an illegal usurpation of power by the Federalists. So he and Madison then turned to the states that were dominated by Republicans, to Kentucky and Virginia, and helped them to issue resolutions that declared those laws to be unconstitutional as a use of federal power, and the states declared them to be null and void. To the Federalists, these resolutions coming out of these states were nothing less than a direct threat to the authority of the federal government. Whereas to Republicans, they were a last-ditch effort to resist federal repression of dissent and to save the Union. So as the election of 1800 drew near, both sides braced themselves for violence, and some prepared themselves for it, as Republican governors in Pennsylvania and Virginia stockpiled arms and readied their states for military action, while the Federalists took steps to ready federal arsenals. Secession or civil war seemed ever closer. The election took place, and the result was deadlock. It was thrown into the House of Representatives, which was dominated by Federalists. So what would they do? Outright usurpation was one possibility. 3 anxious months went by before Congress convened. Then they began balloting on February 11th during a severe snowstorm. Vote after vote, day after day, the impasse remained. Finally, one person changed his vote and changed his mind. And on the 36th ballot, Jefferson was declared the winner. So for the first time, the presidency changed hands from one party to another, and it did so peacefully. During the 1790s, fractious political polarization nearly did the nation in. It threatened 3 of the pillars of democracy, the rule of law, legitimacy of the opposition, and integrity of rights. And let me say a word about the settlement. When we look back today, we tend to imagine that the outcome of the 1800 election was a victory for democracy, but that's a mistake. The Republicans gained the most votes only because of the most fundamentally undemocratic feature of the original US Constitution, the 3/5 clause, which gave extra political power to slaveholders. Without it, the Federalists would have held on to power. If we are looking to the 1790s for some positive message about how democracy can be preserved, it fails to deliver. Slavery did, of course, become an issue as the 19th century proceeded, however, and by the 1850s, Americans were engaged in deep conflict. The parties grew polarized over the issue, and secession and a bloody civil war ensued. All 4 pillars of democracy were threatened and harmed in the process. But I'm going to now return back to the 1890s, where I began the story at the beginning. A few months after the Wilmington coup that I was describing to you, the North Carolina Democratic Party leaders took measures statewide to make their power permanent. They scaled back voting rights by establishing poll taxes and literacy tests. As one Democrat, a state senator, put it, he favored, quote, "a good, square, honest law that will always give us a good Democratic majority." What happened in North Carolina in the 1890s brought out into the open a major transformation that was occurring more quietly all over the South during the period, as white elites shut down the political opposition. The federal government, including Republican presidents, permitted this. In 1898, President McKinley heard the pleas of African Americans in Wilmington asking for help, but failed to intervene. As disenfranchisement happened in state after state, President Theodore Roosevelt simply watched. Then President Taft went so far as to praise the restrictive rules for excluding what he called an ignorant, irresponsible element from the electorate. By the end of the 1890s, all 4 pillars of democracy had suffered harm. The main result was the disenfranchisement of millions of Black men and some poor whites. And once Blacks lost political power, their civil liberties and civil rights were taken away as well. Jim Crow segregation was established, and it lasted 60 years. And while white Southern elites regained extra political power, not only to rule in their own states as autocrats, but also to exercise an outsized voice in national politics for the next half century. And on this slide, I'm showing you really the process through which this occurred, and the harm that was done to each of these pillars of democracy, step by step, sequentially. And democratic backsliding in the 1890s was hardly inevitable. The first three threats coalesced, and political leaders took advantage of them in ways that led to severe backsliding. That racism drove democratic backsliding was plain to see. Southern Democrats sought to gain and hold power and to wrest it from Republicans and populists who'd become increasingly competitive with them. To do so, they embraced white supremacy because it worked incredibly well as a political strategy to unify whites and to sanction removal from the electorate of members of the opposition. But while racism was undoubtedly the most overt threat to democracy, it did not act alone. The decade also featured a high degree of polarization between the parties. Southern Democrats stoked polarization as they sought to unify their supporters. Economic inequality was soaring in the 1890s, but its role in democratic deterioration can easily be missed, in part because the economic elites were divided. The nation featured distinct regional sections, each with its own political economy, and elites with different issue priorities. Industrialists in the North allied themselves with the Republican Party, while planter elites in the South dominated the Democratic Party. The wealthiest Americans, industrial elites, unified themselves and bankrolled what some consider to have been the most expensive presidential race in American history as a percentage of GDP in 1896. The subsequent deterioration of democracy in the South was of little concern to them. Although much has changed, nonetheless, the politics of the 1890s reverberates in our own times. Then as now, we witness a high degree of polarization and rising economic inequality. Some political leaders use race baiting, including that directed toward immigrants, to fuel anger and to promote political participation among white supporters. White supremacy and polarization animate politics and can obscure the purposeful activities of economic elites to achieve their policy goals. So let me step back now and talk a little bit about the historical patterns that we see looking across these 5 periods. In sum, these historical periods reveal that American democracy has been more fragile than we might think. The United States has undergone numerous crises when democracy risked severe deterioration. It's been a tumultuous history, and the past half century was relatively serene by comparison. Over and over again, the nation risked instability, violence, and the demise of rights. All 4 characteristics of democracy were threatened repeatedly, and on occasion, backsliding occurred, some of it with long enduring consequences. The 4 threats have waxed and waned throughout history and combined in different ways. High polarization in all 3 of the earlier periods seemed particularly dangerous and volatile in combination with conflict over membership and status. When 3 threats converged, which happened on 2 occasions, it led to the most dramatic democratic backsliding in American history. Low polarization during the 2 20th century periods that we write about in the book, and I haven't mentioned these to you, the 1930s and 1970s, the fact that the first 3 threats were at a low ebb helped to contain the crises in that period. So you have rising executive aggrandizement in both periods, and we can talk more about this if you'd like during the Q&A. Many Americans in the 1930s were really afraid that the United States was going to go down the same road that they were observing in Europe, that there would be an outbreak of, totalitarian government, that FDR, who was using new executive powers, would become like a dictator. And of course, when the court packing plan moves forward, people are really nervous about this. But it doesn't happen. And so, it's interesting to look back and to think why that is. But the kind of toolkit that presidents from FDR on develop of new executive power leave the door open for a president who will abuse those powers for their own personal or political gain. And Richard Nixon does that in Watergate. And so we look at the Watergate crisis and what happened. There again, that crisis, which was quite egregious, and it's a really fascinating story for us to delve into it. But ultimately, it's contained within the executive branch, and all of the other political actors in the system play their constitutionally prescribed roles, and and check the executive branch. So Congress does, the courts do, and then you also have that happening in the media, etc. And coming out of Watergate, Democrats and Republicans together in Congress worked to enact some reforms that would help to protect the system going forward. But these 4 threats that I've been talking about, they don't by themselves determine what unfolds in politics. They don't operate according to a predictable equation or foreordain some particular outcome. Rather, political actors at any given time period can exert their will and make choices, and it is they, elected officials and organizational leaders and citizens, who make the crucial difference in whether threats will materialize into full-scale danger and damage. They may or may not choose to engage in action to save democracy. And the most sobering observation about the recurring crises of American democracy is that the settlement often revolved around a compromise of democratic values that perpetuated racial hierarchy or exclusion. In fact, when challenges to democracy have been overcome, it's not always been through heroic action by virtuous small d Democrats or high-minded political leaders who acted with restraint and put partisan concerns aside. Rather, put simply, Americans often preserved a version of democracy for themselves by restricting who is included within its promises. So what about today? Where are we today? Now, on this slide, we've added one more row showing the contemporary period. And here we have it that all 4 threats are at a high level today. For the first time in American history, you have the confluence of all 4 of these threats. And we do think this means that democracy is genuinely at risk. So I want to talk for just a few minutes before wrapping up and turning to Q&A about some snapshots of the measures of threats today. So if you look at rising polarization in Congress, it's been increasing as these measures show, both in both chambers. That's what you see on the left, the graph on the left. It's growing in both the House and Senate. And what that measure is, it's a distance between the voting patterns of Democrats and Republicans. So that gap has been growing over these past many decades. And then if you look at just the House alone, you can see what the gap looks like between Democrats and Republicans and how it's been growing. And the Republican Party has moved much further, has become much more extreme and unwilling to compromise, which is what's reflected in that graph. If we look at ordinary citizens and polarization, what this graph shows is what we call negative partisanship. And that is that people don't necessarily think all that highly of their own party, but they hate the other party. They have a very negative view of the other party. So like if you look at in 2016, how people rationalized their votes, many people said that they couldn't stand the candidate for the other party. So that's why they voted for who they did. That's called negative partisanship, and it's really been growing over time. As you can see, people's views of their own party have remained fairly constant, but their views of the opposing party have grown worse and worse over time. And it actually, I need to update these graphs. I was just looking at survey data this morning about how this is getting again worse now in 2020. About the conflict over who belongs, conflict over membership, it's become fused with partisanship in the United States. And it's this combination of threats that is really dangerous. So what this graph is showing is one particular measure that political scientists call racial resentment. It's a handful of survey questions. And if you go back to the 1980s, and this graph is showing you just white Republicans and white Democrats, they differed little from each other in terms of how they answered these questions. And over time, that gap between them grew as the parties kind of sorted themselves out and changed and transformed. And now there's a much bigger gap. And, you might think of this as, it's sort of a question of, is it a glass half empty or a glass half full? In fact, there are more people today who believe that the United States needs to become more equal and to really act on the promises of equality. But they are housed primarily within the Democratic Party. And the Republican Party, which had been active in the civil rights movement and working with President Johnson to, Everett Dirksen, for example, helping to create the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But things have changed in recent decades, and they've changed among ordinary Americans, where now Republicans tend to score higher on these scores called racial resentment. And so you see this bigger gap. On rising economic inequality, this is a measure of it, that the amount of the total income in the United States that the top 1% owns. As you can see, it's very high in the contemporary period. It was very high back in the Gilded Age. And then we had this mid-20th century period that was where we had much greater economic equality in the United States. The gap between the rich and the poor was much less. There was a growing middle class. But we've seen, particularly since the 1970s, rising economic inequality. And I don't really have we don't have one measure for for executive aggrandizement, but it's been growing in numerous ways since the 1930s. And that has happened on both parties' watch. Whether it's a Democrat in the White House or a Republican in the White House, they tend to increase the powers of the presidency and then leave those same tools behind for the next occupant. So the rise of all of these threats long predated President Trump's election in 2016. I would say that his election was a symptom of these threats, not a cause. But once he was in office, he actively intensified them, and it helped to foster greater polarization, for example. So these threats to democracy have really taken on a life of their own over the past many years, in some cases decades, and they're on course now to persist for many more years to come. And we're likely to undergo what some political scientists call careening, of having volatile party conflict that could produce democratic backsliding. So the question for Americans, I'm going to skip over this next slide. The question for Americans has to be how to make the preservation and restoration of democracy our first priority, so that we can pass it on to future generations. American history has been full of such choices, and in some instances, people have chosen a destructive path, as in the 1890s, and in other instances, they found a productive way forward. If history is any guide, we can't take democracy for granted. Democracy has always been what Abraham Lincoln called unfinished work, awaiting renewal and expansion by each new generation. With the nation divided right down the middle, he said in his second inaugural address, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in. Our times call out for us to do the same." So thank you, and I will stop there, and let's open it up to discussion.
All righty. If you guys have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'm also going to share a link with everybody right now, which is for if you want more information or to investigate the book a little bit further. So the first question that we have is from Maura Steffel. And Maura, my apologies if I've done injustice to your name. And the question is, are we at a time when a third major political party might develop?
Well, at first blush, that might seem possible because there certainly is a lot of tension in the Republican Party. I mean, there's tension in the Democratic Party too. And I mean, one thing I should say kind of to preface this is that when you have a two-party system, you're always going to have parties that have tensions within them, because here you have like, this great big nation with all kinds of different interests and values, and you try to pack those into two parties. So it means that the parties, if they're going to be successful, they have to operate as a big tent. And you're always going to have tension trying to keep different groups together. People talk a lot about the tensions between progressives and moderates within the Democratic Party. I would say the Democratic Party has been showing itself to have quite a bit of unity. By contrast, the Republican Party does have some tension right now, certainly, as was, demonstrated, for example, with our own member of Congress, John Katko, being one of 10 Republicans who voted for impeachment in January after the January 6th insurrection, voting for impeachment of President Trump. It remains to be seen what is going to happen in the Senate. It looks like there'll probably be some handful of Republicans who will vote for conviction, but not enough for conviction, most likely. And that's going to cause, continuing tension within the parties, within the Republican Party. Will it break off into a third party? I doubt it. If I'm a betting person, I doubt it. The Republican Party has, as it's emerged since the 1980s, it's had tensions between people who are more social conservatives and those who are more fiscal conservatives, but it has managed to make what can sometimes seem like strange bedfellows to retain unity, because those groups need each other in order to accomplish their goals. And so I am not betting that we're going to see a third party anytime soon.
Next question is from Kim Margozzi, and it's kind of piggybacking on that. If we had more parties, let's say the Bull Moose Party comes back in strength, and we get something with the Europeans, would those parties countervail one another and lead to less polarization, or are the other elements too strong? The other undercurrents you highlighted.
Yeah, the thing is, it's unlikely to happen in the United States. If you look across our history, we've had third parties at various times. And what tends to happen is that then they create some kind of a cleavage in one of the existing parties, and it splits, or they join together. And then you're back to a two-party system again. And the reason why is because of our institutional arrangements for elections, that we have single member districts with winner-take-all elections. And that means that if you vote for Howie Hawkins, our own from Syracuse, Howie Hawkins, or if you vote for the Libertarian candidate or some other candidate, you might feel like that person really represents where you stand, and it's important to you to cast that vote. But it means effectively that you're not having a voice in the system. Of course, it can also throw the election so that the person out of the two main candidates you would have preferred ends up losing. So people are unlikely to, young voters tend to find it more appealing to vote for a third party candidate. Once you live in the United States long enough and you kind of figure it out, this is how it works, you tend to vote for one of the two parties.
The next question comes from Aaron Stuckey, and he asked, do you attribute the big dip that we see currently to the rise of, social media and how easy it is to silo yourself in a specific, or, only ingest one specific,
Sure.
ideological diet, or, are there other ways for this to have happened, even, without that?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on social media, and I think we certainly need a lot of research about that these days, and the effect that it has on polarization and getting messages out like very quickly, and everybody's holding this little machine in their hand that's feeding them tweets that of people who agree with them, and surely that's got to have an impact and reinforce polarization. But it's very striking to me how the country was polarized already in the 1790s. And then we only had these newspapers, and they were very partisan newspapers created by some of the founding fathers themselves, which is pretty amazing. So, technology again and again has been used for political purposes by, public figures throughout our history, from Thomas Jefferson through FDR through Donald Trump, using the latest technology to communicate political messages. And in some periods, if all kinds of other conditions are right, it leads to polarization, and in some periods it doesn't. So to me, the social media is not the cause, because polarization, as you saw, like on some of those graphs I showed, has been growing for a few decades before we even had Twitter. And so Twitter may be exacerbating it, and other kinds of social media may be exacerbating it, but it's not the cause.
So next question comes from Deborah Harrington Merriweather, and she asks, how much do you think American tent revival or an appeal to emotion over reason have led to the current situation? Are we too emotional, not analytical in our politics?
That's an interesting question. Are we too emotional, not analytical? Well, certainly there are people who are not me. I'm not a political psychologist, but there are political scientists who are political psychologists, and they study the role of emotion quite a bit. And so I'll tell you a little bit of what I've learned from them about contemporary polarization. There's a great scholar named Lily Mason at the University of Maryland who studies the fact that so the Republican Party today is different. It's obviously different from the Democratic Party, but if you look at who's in it, it tends to be more homogenous in terms of being more white and Christian, and more rural people. And the Democratic Party is actually, as the nation has become more diverse in recent decades, the Democratic Party has pretty well kept pace with the nation in terms of its racial and ethnic mix within the party. So Democrats, as they interact with each other and they try to work out their policy platform and everything, they're encountering people different from themselves. Republicans, not so much. It's a very homogenous party. And so where does emotion come in with all of this? What Lily Mason argues is that when you are interacting with people very much like yourselves, and they're your political party, and then if your party loses, you take it very emotionally. You feel like it's a personal affront. The outcome of that election in which your side loses feels like it is an attack on your way of life and your culture and your values. And that can make people more emotional. So there's, some of the scholarship and what might be involved in it. Yeah.
Next question comes. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, certainly there's a lot of emotions. I don't want to say that only Republicans who are emotional. I think in 2016, a lot of Democrats, when Trump was elected, were very emotional in response as well, too. And I think that probably goes with polarization and this whole sense of us versus them, that there are these two different worldviews. And so if your side loses, it's quite emotional for people.
Next question comes from Patty Black, who's actually one of the founders of the Strathmore Speaker Series. And she asks, are there any concrete suggestions that you might offer the average citizen as a way to help preserve democracy? And piggybacking on that, a question that I was going to ask that seems apropos was, as a librarian, which is a public institution, are there any institutions or things that institutions like libraries could do to act as a bulwark against these trends?
I think libraries are a great bulwark against these trends. Absolutely, as a public institution, that it allows people to gain reputable information. So that's excellent. I think the kind of answers I'll give, you'll say, well, it does, I'm going to give you an answer and you'll say, look, I knew that. I didn't need a political scientist to tell me that. But it's the basic things. I mean, obviously, we need to participate in politics. And one thing I must say was extraordinary and is a testament to the health of American democracy is that in the 2020 election, in the midst of a pandemic, we had the highest voter turnout we've had since 1900 as a proportion of the electorate, which is stunning, And so there are, many things that we could point to that actually show health of democracy, and that's one of them. And I think Americans really cared, and they saw a lot being at stake, and people donned their masks and or sent in their mail-in ballots and found a way to vote. So that kind of political participation is important. I would also say that we do need to go back to the basics of really thinking about and respecting these basic pillars of democracy. I think we had the luxury in the late 20th century and early 21st century of taking them for granted, and, not really worrying about free and fair elections. And, until about 2014, in public opinion polls, Americans across the board, Democrats and Republicans, would say that they respected the outcomes of elections. They thought elections were well run in the United States, that they were legitimate, et cetera. And then that changed very quickly. And, one of the things Trump did constantly from the time he was a candidate was to try to undermine Americans' confidence in elections. That's really problematic. I mean, as I think was evident to many people, although a lot of people still doubt this, state and local officials who run elections take it very seriously and work really hard to make sure that the election is free and fair. But I think a lot of Americans today don't really know that. And so I think, educating people more about that and letting people that know about that as well is important. So anyway, I could go on and on, but those are some of the basics of reinforcing the importance of things like the rule of law, the integrity of rights, etc.
Okay, next question comes from John Presepiora, and he says, great presentation. And the executive aggrandizement seems to him to be, I guess, primary among the threats we currently face. And he asks, as the executives continue to do things that, impede our ability to have a successful democracy, is there any way we can break the cycle, absent congressional intervention?
Well, it's really tricky. It's really hard because as polarization has grown, it has really hurt Congress's ability to get things done. And Congress it's a complex system. It's bicameral, and then you have these committees within each. It's full of obstacles and hurdles to action. And action tends to only happen if you can create big coalitions that are going to work together across party lines to get things done. And when you look across the periods of American history where we had major lawmaking going on, that's what was happening. It's very heavy lift otherwise. So you hear all this talk now about for Biden's stimulus plan. Will they use reconciliation? So it only takes 50 votes plus the vice president coming in, which is, what both Democrats and Republicans have been using in recent years when they hold the majority, because it's very hard for them to get the 60 votes they need to overcome the filibuster. So I'm sorry, I tend to elaborate at some length. But to get back to the executive aggrandizement, the reason that this is so problematic is that the American people expect politicians to deliver. And the main person they see is the president, unitary actor. Presidents, because they're looking at Congress, and Congress is not accomplishing their policy goals for them, even when their own party is in power in both branches, it's really tough, then they are tempted to use executive authority instead to get things done. And this is what has been growing, over time for that reason. So it's hard to scale it back. Either party wants to do it when the other party's in power, but they don't want to do it when their party is in power. But I do think that there are ways to try to strengthen Congress vis-a-vis the legislature, and some is with, oversight. The oversight, the ability for Congress to engage in oversight has been becoming very weak, but I think that we need some of those kind of post-Watergate reforms now to try to strengthen it.
Another question. This one is from my wife, actually, who's handed me a piece of paper off screen. And she asks, is there anything that we could do in the electoral system, maybe changing the mechanisms to add something like, ranked choice voting that could maybe help tamp down on the polarization?
Yeah, my political science colleague, Lee Drutman at the New America Foundation, he's a big proponent of ranked choice voting. And, that may help. I actually tend to be somewhat skeptical of the kinds of institutional fixes because, some of them, like people say, like, why don't we get rid of the Electoral College? Well, that's not about to happen. We don't have the political will for that. And then others, sometimes they're not as effective as you would hope, and they also can have unintended consequences that you don't imagine. So, the most important thing to do is that people simply need to organize and be politically active. And, there's no substitute for that, for, working hard to mobilize people that can overcome all of these hindrances to voting that occur. And that's a way that, groups really gain political power and can make a difference.
All right, I think those are, let me see, I think there's one last question, maybe related to the social media question we had earlier, and this might be a way that maybe it's driving the polarization. Susan Nelson asks, with the way we actually interact with one another has changed dramatically, and the pandemic has only exacerbated this by forcing us all to meet in this forum and not in person. Was there more face-to-face interaction at other times? And if we were to get back to this, where we actually had to look one another in the eye and deal with our issues, would that potentially mitigate polarization?
I do think that face-to-face interaction is really important. And it's important, even for people who are within the same political party, to, kind of bridge those differences that I was talking about. Because, people learn about each other's point of view. They are more likely to, understand how to put themselves in each other's shoes. There's a lot of research about how in the middle of the 20th century, we had really active civic organizations, and lots of them, and people belong to them. And they, I don't want to romanticize this period, because many of them, they were racially segregated and some were gender segregated, but they often tended to be cross-class, and people would meet people different from themselves in that way. And then also they tended to be federated organizations where, your own local chapter was part of something bigger than yourself. And so you kind of were bonded to other Americans through that larger structure. And active civic life like that seemed to be really conducive to democracy. It seemed to be really healthy to political democracy. People learned skills, political skills, through participating in civic organizations, and they transferred over to the political realm. So, I guess, one hope is that when we all emerge from our homes and take off our masks somewhere down the line when the pandemic is over, if there could be some kind of rebirth of people. I see one person put in the chat, bowling. Yes, so we're not bowling alone, bowling together. Robert Putnam is the scholar who coined that phrase at Harvard. I think that would be really helpful to our democracy, and to try to talk to people who have different points of view than ourselves. And that's really difficult these days, but it's especially hard when we just don't even see each other because we're in such different, little bubbles and isolated from each other. That's really problematic.
Hopefully we'll have a roaring 20s again, where we all ditch the devices and go actually
interact with other human beings.
Interact with one another. I think we have time for one more question, and that is again from Patty Black, who asks, what about gerrymandering and voter suppression that you brought up? Is there anything we can do, or again, is this just we're waiting for the foxes to, have some morals while they're guarding the hen house?
Yeah. So, with gerrymandering, it's very interesting. I'm working on a new project now about the rural-urban divide, which seems to be a major source of polarization these days. And one of the things I've learned in working on that is that while gerrymandering is a real problem in some states, the bigger problem is the sorting of the population these days. So, the way it works now is that Democrats tend to be, cities tend to be full of Democrats, lots and lots of Democrats. And so they're inefficiently distributed, whereas Republicans are more distributed across geographic space. There's, rural areas tend to have majorities of Republicans, but there's still a lot of independents and Democrats there, and, a little bit more in suburbs, et cetera. And it's because of those different residential patterns that it's almost impossible to draw congressional district lines that overcome that sorting. And so that is necessarily going to give you these districts that tends to give Republicans an advantage in drawing district lines. And it tends to prevent people from coming together with people so different from themselves, like we're talking about. So, a really radical idea, if people really want to solve problems in American politics, what I say to my undergraduates is they need to, instead of, following all of their friends in moving to coastal cities in blue states, they need to come to other parts of the country. They need to move to like upstate New York, where we are, which is a more diverse place politically, or, move to other states in the country. And, that would actually make a big difference, but people don't seem ready to take that sort of action yet.
Well, as a recent transplant from Brooklyn, I will say amen to that.
Yeah, you've done your part.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to thank you to Dr. Mettler. I'm going to throw it over to Mary Beth, and she's going to take us out and tell you about some upcoming events we have, and go to that.
Great. Well, thank you for all your questions. I really enjoyed them.
Thank you, Suzanne, for joining us here tonight and sharing your insights into the state of our democracy. Keep in mind that our programs are always on the second Thursday of the month. Our next speaker will be on March 11th, and will feature Dr. Samuel Gruber, who will lead us on a virtual tour of Ward Wellington Ward houses in Syracuse. Dr. Gruber is an instructor of art and music history at Syracuse University, and he's the founder of Gruber Heritage Local. He's an expert on the impact of the arts and crafts movement in Syracuse, and his talk will be co-sponsored by the Arts and Crafts Society of Central New York. On April 8th, please join us for guest speaker Eddie Brennan, president of Beacon Skiff. He'll share the story of how his family business started as a farm and evolved into alcohol production and ultimately a well-polished tourist and event destination. You can find updates on the series at our website, strathmorespeakers.com. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you again in March. Thanks, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.